Wouldn't it be nice to live in a comfortable place that you can proudly call home? Maybe you have access to this house already, but perhaps you're still working towards it. You can join the club because we all call this the American Dream. We call this the American Dream because we believe that a good house is a result of being hardworking, successful, basically a prize that we must earn in this country. A prize more than a need. Let's think about this. When we think of basic needs, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe access to water, the ability to afford food, perhaps access to better health. How about shelter? What do we imagine when we talk about shelter? You'd hope to be a house, right? But it could also be defined as what the city provides, just somewhere where you have to be in. Shelter can be so loosely defined, and yet when we think about shelter, what we want as shelter is something that we want to be happy with. If shelter can be downgraded into simply a place with a roof, do we necessarily need good housing then? Or is shelter provided by the government good enough? Proper housing is associated with having better access to a healthier lifestyle. In a 2024 research paper, Nichols described how there's a deep connection between housing and access to basic needs. It emphasizes how people without housing are more susceptible to diseases because of their lack of clean food or the lack of access to being able to wash yourself. Recall the lockdown of COVID-19. We were told to stay in homes in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But what about those without homes? Granted, they may be offered shelters during this time, but it wasn't likely. During this time, people still had the fear of how contagious this virus is. This isn't to say that people haven't been doing enough. In fact, people from the public health field have been trying to create models to combat homelessness. There does appear to be bias, models that seem to reject the idea of obstacles that can stand in the way of proper housing. This means that they are less likely to have access to better health, less likely to have just enough food, less likely to have clean water, etc., etc. So, what are these bias specifically? What are the obstacles that stand in the way of proper housing? There are a lot. For this video, though, we are going to analyze redlining specifically. Redlining appears to be the more prominent issue within housing, and yet you might think that it isn't as prominent or as effective due to the fact that it did end it a couple years ago. However, that is simply not the case. An article by Jacob Trimmer described how redlining was created. During the New Deal initiative, they basically labeled neighborhoods with perceived credit risk, which makes people living within these neighborhoods to be denied mortgage loans. The writer claims that redlining wasn't necessarily a practice against minorities specifically, and tried to use data to support this. However, it very evidently was, and the effects did in fact show right when redlining was taken out, which, if anything, it means that redlining is now part of the roots of systemic housing discrimination. This means that people who are stuck within these neighborhoods will not be able to easily have access to a better house or have resources to get another house. They are basically trapped. Even though redlining was in fact removed, it didn't stop the neighborhoods from being in poor quality. Even though the government is providing programs to combat homelessness, they are more likely to forget that there is systemic housing discrimination. Therefore, the people who are stuck in the poor quality neighborhoods, they are less likely to receive these resources. And it seems that the government fails to realize how important it is to have good housing, or better yet, good affordable housing. There is such thing as the housing market, as many of you are familiar with. But it also became a barrier for our personal finances. How did it even become both a strength in the macroeconomy and a burden for ourselves? There are many risks to either buy or rent a house. When you buy a house, you're entering the housing market where you are still likely to lose a house. Consider the 2008 housing crisis. During this crisis, many people were losing their homes or threatened to lose their homes. It turns out that one of the main causes was mortgage rates, undue mortgage rates that were difficult to pay for. But people still wanted to buy the house because it was safer. And generally it is. You are more likely to encounter a better neighborhood, better education, better anything really. The article states that state efforts to provide affordable housing negatively correlates with house ownership rates. This could mean that people are becoming less confident with the housing market and are more likely to rent houses. Whether or not they have access to financial literacy, people may still find rent as a much safer option because it takes a lot more time to save up and maintain a house than it does for renting. Even then, finding affordable housing is still difficult, even for renting. It causes more frustration but it also provides more motivation to reach a goal of buying a house. However, it also creates a negative social effect that I believe we should address as soon as possible. There's a neighborhood in Oakland where people got together, both homed and homeless, to create a neighborhood that satisfies all their needs and creates a friendly community. They contain free resources, access to health, and yet they are still threatened by the government, which leads them to protest against the move. This seems to emphasize the idea of how little humanity that the government shows against homeless people, and they are far from the only one. In fact, one of the individuals living in this neighborhood says,
Just because there's a slight difference of the way that we might want to live, people out here don't want to slave 80 hours a week for somebody who's becoming a billionaire looking down on everybody. It's not people that are lazy or that everyone out here is on drugs or crazy or what. It's a different way of living that was a way of living that centuries ago people were living this way in communities.
recall all the articles made on the homeless. It seems that they consistently put people without homes as homeless, as if they're a separate population. In the world of individuality, we think of the world as winners and losers, a world where people either have homes or they don't. The way that the media seems to use homeless people rather than people without homes, or just people in general, seems to enforce the idea of winners and losers, of people who have succeeded and bought a home and those who were not so lucky, born into a system that wasn't fair to begin with. But maybe it is time that we view housing as a necessity, as something that we all deserve. In an alternative universe where housing is considered a necessity, we would behave incredibly different. We do not shame those without homes. Instead, we try to support them. We do not feel jealousy for those with mansions. Instead, we might find our own homes perfect the way it is. We're living in a capitalistic system where housing is not treated as something that we need, but instead a goal that we have for our entire life, a goal that we call the American dream.